I think genre is pretty much a construct of the publishing industry, as much, and bookshop owners for that matter, because quite rightly you need to know where to place it on the shelves. Hi, I'm Mark Smith, the author of Three Boys Gone. It's out now with Pan Macmillan. In Three Boys Gone, they're going to be plunged immediately into the action because in the first chapter, three boys run ahead of their bushwalking group on a school camp and they throw themselves into a wild sea. All three of them are swept out. And when their young female outdoor education teacher arrives on the scene, the boys are already drowning. And she has to make the decision about whether she will go in after them and risk her own life. In fact, she's certain she will die if she goes in as well. And so the teacher, Grace Disher, she makes the decision not to attempt the rescue. First rule of rescue is don't create another casualty. And there's no spoilers in that because that's the first chapter, and the reader is quite deliberately thrown into that action immediately. I've worked in outdoor education for 30 years, and a lot of that time has been spent on what I call the wild west coast of Victoria. And so the beach that I describe where this incident happens is actually one which is very, very firmly entrenched in my mind because I have been there literally, I've walked that beach literally more than 100 times with students. So I know what it's like in all its different moods. I know what it's like when the swell is small on a sunny day. I know what it's like when it's wild on a winter's day when a big swell is hitting. So I'm very much an advocate of that, writing what you're familiar with, what you know, and that to me is just second nature, pardon the pun. But it is that writing is hard. And so anything you can do to make the writing easier is a good thing. And writing about something that you are intimately familiar with is a much easier task than creating a whole new setting that you yourself may not be familiar with. Hence, I draw on that natural landscape in all of my writing, really, in all of my books. And I bring it in and I use it in a way that it's almost a character in the book in itself. And I think we learn a lot about our human characters in the book through the way they interact with that natural environment. And it's how they respond to it that helps me develop the human characters as well. So it sort of happens by osmosis. And it's just I guess it's a motif in a lot of my writing. I wanted to present an enormous moral dilemma. And this is the dilemma that Grace faces in an instant, really, probably in 1 or 2 short minutes on the beach, about whether she is going to risk her life by going in and trying to save those students. I do want my readers to feel that for themselves. What would I have done in that situation? And I'm not, as a writer, I don't think I'm here to provide answers. I think I'm here to ask questions. And in that way, the reading becomes a creative process as well, as the reader immerses themselves in the text, identifies and empathizes with the protagonist, and they start to feel and think in the way that she does, or I hope that they do. And if they do, then I've done my job. I'm absolutely wanting them to ask themselves, what would I do in that situation? But I'm also wanting them to see it from multiple different perspectives through the book and not just through Grace's eyes. I think that's really important. And having been involved in rescues, I know that you really don't know what you are going to do until you are confronted by it. And I guess in some situations, if it was your own child, if it was a member of your family that was in there, you wouldn't hesitate. You go straight in. But what if it's two strangers? What is you're just walking along the beach, and as it was in my case, and they're two strangers. I didn't know who they were. I didn't have any equipment with me, and I did actually go out and I brought them in. It was a long, difficult struggle, and I'm not trying to do a hero thing or anything, because it was surf lifesavers do that every day, and they volunteer to do it. But I want my reader to reflect in the way that I reflected after that real incident, and that was, well, should I have done that? Should I have gone in? What was the danger to myself? What about my responsibilities and my family? And And so often and we see it through the news all across the summer, when someone goes in to try to rescue a member of their family or somebody else, and it's the rescuer, the one who's attempting the rescue, who's the one that dies. And unfortunately, that's a tragic circumstance that we see over and over again. This is the fifth book that I've written, but of course, the first four have all been for a young adult audience, and this is my first one for an adult audience. So this is a psychological thriller. And I often get asked the question, what's it like to move genres and to write in a different genre? And my answer is always the same, and that is a writer is a writer is a writer. And I think you can bring the same skills in developing plot and structure and character and setting into an adult novel just as easily as writing for young adults. In actual fact, I think that writing for young adults is actually great grounding for writing an adult thriller, because with writing with young adults, you have to keep, it's narrative drive that keeps the kids turning the page. And so you learn all about that. You learn about, how you need to plot it and how you need to keep them turning the page. I just brought that to the adult to the adult sort of genre of writing, and it was I don't think it was any more difficult than writing for young adults, and I think I could probably swap back and forth if I needed to, but I think it's I really do believe that you're a writer, and the genre that you write in, I think genre is pretty much a construct of the publishing industry as much, and bookshop owners for that matter, because quite rightly you need to know where to place it on the shelves. Is this a psychological thriller? Is this crime? Is this memoir? Whatever it might be, and that's why we sort of write into those genres. I'm very lucky at the moment because when I was writing my young adult novels, I was working full time as a campus director of an outdoor education campus. Now I am writing full time, and my day is my own, really. I can get up. I generally, when I'm in writing mode, what I call writing mode, when I'm working on a manuscript, I'll get up at 6:30 in the morning and I'll write for 3 hours. And then I'll have breakfast, and the rest of the day is my own. I can go for a surf, I can walk the dog, I can ride my bike, whatever it might be, which is just an ideal lifestyle as far as I'm concerned. But of course, you don't actually leave the writing behind at the desk. It's with you all the time during the day. So during that day, I might be nutting out just while I'm doing something that's just muscle memory, like going for a surf or riding my bike. I'll be nutting out what's next, what's logically going to happen next. And by the time I come back to my desk at 6:30 the next morning, I've pretty much got that sorted out. And so I can pick it up and run with it again. But establishing that writing routine is critical. You can't, unless you've got an established routine, or for me, if I don't have an established routine, there's too many reasons I could go for a surf early or not. So I'd be a real procrastinator if I didn't have that structure already in place. What was the biggest writing disaster you've had? um, Interesting, because I haven't had anything that's been a complete failure. So virtually everything I've written has got up somewhere, but I've gone through, and this is what I think what happens to a lot of writers is that you go through, you write something, it might be a full manuscript, it might be a short story, and you just get rejection after rejection after rejection after rejection because it's just not right for that particular publishing house or that particular competition, or you don't get shortlisted, and that can get very frustrating, and you can really be deflated by it. And we all have to deal with rejection. All writers need to deal with rejection, but the particular story that I'm thinking about would have been rejected. I don't know. And this was not a novel; it was a short story. Would have been rejected at least half a dozen times, and then when I was beginning to write a novel, and I went back to that short story and I said, "Oh, I think that short story could actually be turned into a novel," and that's what I did, and that became The Road to Winter, which is now on curriculum in schools all around the country. It's sold tens of thousands of copies, and it's my most successful book. But it began with all those rejections, so not necessarily a disaster, but probably a good insight into what writing can be, and how you can get knocked down and you've got to get back up again. I was asked a very similar question in recently, and it was about is there still a role for story? Does the need for story still exist? And my answer was emphatically yes. And I think it's a writer's obligation at the moment to try and reflect as much as possible. Well, for me, I can talk for myself, as much as possible for what is happening in my world, and not just my world in my little community, but my entire world that I live in. And we often talk about when a critic or a teacher is looking at a novel, they're looking, what are the themes and issues here, but we as writers, or I as a writer, I don't write to themes and issues. I want to write a good story, but I do know that I can have those little, dropping those little pinpoints everywhere along the way, which can raise issues and I can do it through my characters. So I think it's imperative on us as writers to engage with for me, it's not engaging with a pretend world, but engaging with either the world as we find it at the moment or the world as we might envisage it in the future. For that reason, I'm not that interested. I'm not a historical novel reader. I'm not a historical novel writer. I'm very much engaged with where we are at the moment, and I think that we have also a critical role in that. Um, so much of humans' time in 2025 is taken up in front of screens, is consumed by screens, and we have something which can be this incredible break from that, and from this that beauty of holding a book in your hand and the smell of it, and getting into bed at night and holding it in your hands. And I don't think we want to get into bed at night and look at a screen again. I think we want to, and I know that ebooks, that all has a role, and I understand why. And I use Kindles when I travel, as an example, because it's just so much more efficient. But I think, yeah, there's so many roles that I think writers do have, and I also, to an extent, I understand people writing escapist um, types of books, because the world, let's face it, the world at the moment is in pretty dire circumstances and seems to be getting worse and worse. And I can understand people and readers wanting an escape from that. So I'm probably contradicting a little bit what I said before, but for me myself, it's not to write fantasy. It's to try and engage as much with where we are at the moment and how we might do better as human beings. I read across a really broad spectrum. So I read crime. I mostly read literary fiction, and I really enjoy that. I love taking books apart by other writers, and seeing the way. How did you get me here? How did you do this? And I don't think you ever read in the same way again once you're a writer, because you are trying to learn as much about your craft as you go along. We were talking before the interview about a favourite author of mine, Robbie Arnott. And every time I pick up a new book from Robbie, I know I'm going to learn something more about the craft of writing. And his two most recent ones, Limberlost and Dusk, I think are just incredibly. I mean, apart from telling an amazing story, both telling amazing stories, they're so exquisitely written. And especially for me, and the way in which I try to use landscape in my writing. And for me, Robbie uses landscape in a way, and his description of landscape, engagement with it, is just second to none. My story is that as a teenager, I was not a reader at all. I wasn't. I was a total non-reader. And unfortunately, I had a very bad accident when I was 15, and I had to recuperate for 6 months. I had to lie on my back in traction, and this was way before the internet, so I had no Netflix, no Stan, no games, etc. So my mum started bringing me books to read, and I used those books as a means of coping with this situation that I was in. And the first book that had the biggest impact on me was Storm Boy by Colin Teely. And I look at that now and I think I've absorbed so much of that into my own writing, because what was it? When I was 15, I was a total outdoors boy, and that was one of the reasons I wasn't a reader. I always associated reading with being indoors. But what Colin Teely did in that book was he brought the environment, he brought the outdoors into the writing. Those beautiful descriptions of the Coorong in South Australia, and that's what engaged me. And so I definitely pinpoint that as one. In terms of becoming a writer myself, might seem a little bit odd, but and not that far from where we are at the moment. But My Brother Jack by George Johnson was a book that was really, I read at a very formative time. I was at uni at the time. I was trying to work out, I was training to be a teacher, and I was going to do English teaching. And I just remember that book as being one that engaged me in, and I talked about where we live. I knew where he was writing about. I knew that whole area, the suburbs of Melbourne, and even though it was set during the Second World War, and that set me off on this journey of sort of he and living on Hydra, and then Leonard Cohen and Charmaine, the whole all of those artists coming together, and that kind of set me off, and his struggles as a writer as well, and because he wrote a lot before he hit that sort of gold mine of My Brother Jack. And so, in terms of setting me off as a writer, I didn't start writing straight away then because life got in the way, as it does. But that was a novel that, and I think it's actually still one of the great Australian novels. People talk about Patrick White, Tree of Man, and books like that, and I do too. I think they're magnificent. But for me personally, My Brother Jack was just at this pivotal time. And we talk about our favourite books or the books that we have loved the most. Often it's where we are ourselves at the time that we're reading them, and that really heavily influences how we respond to them. What's next for me? I have written another novel, and it's just about ready to hand in to get to my agent, who's been pushing me for it, um, not too subtly. And so it is another thriller, and it's set in Melbourne, and it's about an Extinction Rebellion type protest that goes horribly wrong. And the young activists who are involved in the protest are on the run in their own city. They've been branded as terrorists, and they are being hunted. So that's the premise, and it's all written. I don't know how much of what I've written, it's about 80,000 words, how much of that's going to find its way into print, but I hope it does, because it's a really engaging story, and it addresses lots of stuff about where we are at the moment as a society, the way in which protest is being stymied, about the way in which climate change is being downplayed, when it's really an existential crisis as far as I'm concerned. So I wanted to bring all of that into a novel, and make it exciting and turn it into a thriller. It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.